Hello everybody, today's video is going to be a buyer's guide on a Porsche model that is currently experiencing a bit of a renaissance, the 944. I'm going to start with some of the model history and then give you a few tips on what to look out for if you want to buy one. The 944 was introduced in 1982 as a replacement to the 924. It was actually on sale for a few of the same years, so it wasn't strictly a replacement. It was also a more upmarket alternative and designed to plug the gap between the 924 and the evergreen 911. Visually, the 944 is an evolution of the wide-arched 924 Carrera GT, and to my eyes, I think it's survived the years a lot better. The early 924s do look like very much a product of the 70s, whereas the 944 in the correct specification is just a bit more timeless. However, the biggest criticism of the 924 was always its engine. Because that car started life as a joint VW Porsche project, the engine was a fairly humble 2-litre that some people called a van engine, although that strictly isn't true, and it actually had a lot of Audi influence. So with the 944, Porsche wanted to give it a pure Porsche engine, and so it got an all-new 2.5-litre 8-valve unit that was essentially half of a 928's V8. In order to make it drive smoothly, it got 2 balancer shafts, so it felt more like a straight 6 in practice. Power initially was a very modest 143 horses.
That is, if you were in America. 944 stats are confusing to say the least, with multiple official sources conflicting and not making my life easy. I believe European specification cars received a 163 horsepower version of the engine, and it was only in the final years of production where Porsche homogenized power outputs for the naturally aspirated car across all the world markets.
Nearly all 944s come with a 5-speed manual transmission located at the rear of the car in transaxle configuration for optimum balance. The car has a near 50-50 weight distribution with just over 50% at the front and just under at the rear. They are 2+2s, although the rear seats are a little bit cramped, but the boot is a good size if somewhat shallow. It is a very decent tourer because it's somewhat practical and has an 80-litre fuel tank, so although fuel economy isn't the best, range is excellent. The car evolved slowly over the first few years, with the major changes being the introduction of options like power steering. However, in 1985 you saw a fairly dramatic shake-up of the line. You got a new interior with what's called the oval dash, new door cards, new seats, some mechanical changes, mostly to the suspension, and we also saw the introduction of the turbo model, which introduced not just a more powerful engine, but also a new look for the 944 with its more rounded, integrated front bumper. The regular car carried on with its original styling for a few years, and I have to say, I kind of like them both. They're just a very different look. Porsche have long been pioneers of forced induction, both on road and track. And here they managed to create something of a legend, because with its 220 horsepower, the 944 finally got the firepower to go toe-to-toe with its bigger brother, the 911. Internally, the 944 Turbo is known as the 951 or the 952 if it's right-hand drive, although I've never actually heard anyone call it that. This car was also a world first in that it had the same performance specifications regardless of whether you had a catalytic converter fitted or not. That was actually an optional piece of equipment in some territories and mandatory in other, and it was a far cry from about only 10 years previous when Porsche had to make 3 different engines for each of their cars. One for the global market, one for the Americans, and one for the Californians. So at long last, everybody could enjoy the same performance wherever they were. The last few years of 944 production got a little bit confusing as Porsche desperately tried to keep interest high and the model looking fresh. In 1987 you got the 16-valve 944S making 190 horsepower from its naturally aspirated engine. However, that model failed to sell very well. In 1988 you had the 1-year only Turbo S, of which this is an example, and I'll do a whole video dedicated to this model and what makes it stand out. The key thing to remember though is that this car made 250 horsepower, and after 1988 so did all of the rest of the turbos. 1988 also saw an upgrade in power for the base 2.5-litre 944 to 163 horsepower. In 1989 the base car then got a 2.7-litre engine, although strangely power rose by only 2 horses to 165. Then finally you got what I think is the best model of them all. By 1990, the regular 944 was essentially discontinued, but what we got was the 944S 2. Now, many people think of that as meaning the Series 2, but that's not what it stands for. It is, in fact, the 944 S2. It's their second attempt at making an S, and second time round, I think they got it absolutely spot on. So the S2 took the turbos, slightly curvier, fresher looking body, and installed a 3-litre 16-valve engine that made 211 horsepower. So it was a fairly powerful car, nearly the same as the regular turbo, but had the fresher looks and without any of the turbo's extra maintenance woes. You also saw the introduction of cabriolet versions for both the S2 and the turbo. There were a few special editions like the UK only 944 SE, and that kept things going until 1992 when the model was finally discontinued and replaced with the 968. So that's a brief look at the evolution of the 944 over the decade it was in production. Now, what do you need to know if you're going to buy one? Well, the most important thing from my perspective to remember is this. For a very long time, the 944 was one of the cheapest ways into Porsche ownership. I was actually offered one about 10 years ago that was working, had just passed its MOT for £700. So that means the vast majority of them at some point in their life have probably been owned by somebody that didn't take the care with it you'd probably like. This does not mean though that they are all bad ones. In fact, far from it, and the last few years we've probably seen the worst examples either disappear or be given the love that they deserve. And with prices being stronger than they ever have been, there are no excuses for poor examples. We may not like to admit it, but the 944 is about to celebrate its 40th birthday. I'm not sure about you, but I still think of the 80s as 20 years ago. Sadly, they were not. Now, the earliest cars had, for the time, a very common recommendation of service intervals at 6,000 miles. It's pretty unlikely you're going to find a car that's actually had that stuck to throughout its entire life. So instead, what you want to look for is a service history that's as complete as you can find it, preferably with paperwork to back up the stamps. A simple service book really, to me, actually means very little. I like high mileage cars that have seen consistent use, a few thousand miles a year, say, and that means you're more likely to get a car which has had things that need doing done. Cars which don't get driven don't have problems found in them, and if you want to use and enjoy your car, you may find buying a Garage Queen could turn out to be a costly mistake. Cam belt intervals are recommended at 4 years, although there's no harm probably in stretching that a little bit, but if your car is due, either have the belts changed or at least have them inspected. A belt change is not horrific on one of these, budget about £500. In truth, most of the servicing on these, general maintenance, is not actually that bad. Spark plugs are about £3 each. Oil and filter is not that bad. Even brake discs on this Turbo S are something like £400 for discs and pads on the front axle, with other cars having discs available from as little as about £60. Engine rebuilds are not uncommon to see as the mileage increases, anything between 1 to 200,000 miles. I wouldn't be surprised if you see evidence of some work to the car. It's not an indication of abuse. This particular example had a new engine at 143,000 miles, although we don't know the specific circumstances as to why that happened. Many of the more expensive cars had air conditioning, like this Turbo S, and you should check that, along with all of the other electrics, work. The aircon should blow icy cold, and don't believe any seller that says it just needs a regas. Never once has that actually been true. The 944 owners that I've spoken to have had a variety of different experiences with their cars. Some have never had any problems at all, whereas others have had cars that seem to be nearly constantly needing something. The truth is, any car, especially a sporty one of this age, is going to need quite a lot spent on it, simply refreshing the components that will naturally wear out over time, if not just mileage. And the 944 can throw problems at you, some of which are quite cheap, some of which less so. To give you an example, I've had 2 issues with this car, one of which was the fan staying on, actually a common problem and something it experienced in 1998. That's usually caused by one of 2 things. Either the relay has failed, or in my case, it was the thermal switch on the radiator. A problem that actually also afflicted the 968 too, and luckily is not actually that expensive to sort. It's a £30 part and about an hour's labour from your local friendly garage. I also suffered some running issues the other day, and I suddenly started to panic that the car might need a rebuild or something dramatic had gone wrong, the turbo had failed. No, it was simply a popped off hose. The suspension on this car has recently been refreshed, and to bring it up to factory standard cost about £3,000. There are many components here that you might want to look at. Springs can snap or corrode, dampers can seize or simply fail, and there are lots of bushings in here which are well-known failure points too, although luckily most of these parts are actually fairly easy to acquire. In fact, generally speaking, parts for these cars are not that pricey. The issue often is labour. Because they are still really a 1970s design, most cars from that time period weren't really built to be that maintenance friendly. The biggest problem with the 944 though, without a shadow of a doubt, is rust. Though they had a galvanised chassis, that hasn't really stopped rust being one of the biggest killers of 944s, and probably one of the reasons very few are still on the road today. This car had nearly £10,000 spent on it sorting out the corrosion and the paintwork. The whole bottom of this car had basically gone. The sills like to rust from the inside out. So if you're looking at one of these cars and the bottom is just a little bit bubbly, by the way, there should be some bubbling to the bottom. It's the anti-stone chip stuff they put on. But if it's the wrong type of bubbling down there, then do budget quite a bit of money to weld in and paint replacement sills. And if this bottom section is actually unusually smooth, do check that someone hasn't just filled over a very, very large problem. For the most part though, follow standard, sensible car buying procedure. I prefer to get something like this privately, because that way you can speak to the owner and get a feel for if they're a real enthusiast that will have cared after the car like you would hope. Check all of the electrics. Do they work? Do the pop-ups pop up? Are the fluids all correct and ready? When you saw the car, had they left it cold for you so they weren't trying to hide any potential issues? Incidentally, if you are checking the fluids and you find out that the coolant is a little bit milky, you don't necessarily need to run a mile. These cars were known for heat exchanger failure, and when that happens, oil and water can mix, so it's not necessarily head gasket issues. Of course, with something like this, you can also get a pre-purchase inspection. If you're in the east of England, I highly recommend William Francis, who are based near Bury St Edmunds. They're very good, a trusted friend of mine, and he will tell you if a car you're looking at buying is worth it. With prices being stronger than they ever have been, I'd say the few £100s you'd spend on getting a car inspected will almost certainly be money well spent. If you're unable to take the car to a specialist for inspection, I would highly recommend joining or speaking to the Porsche Club of Great Britain. They have model-specific registers, which have many experts on each particular car who'll be able to tell you all the things you need to look for if you have to inspect a car yourself. I would always insist on a test drive where you can, because cars like this should drive really nicely, and if they feel wrong, they probably are wrong. Things like clutches aren't really much of a concern. They can last a very long time and aren't that expensive. It's not unusual to get 80,000 miles out of one, and replacement is about £1,000. Prices for the 944 now seem to start at around the £6,000 to £7,000 mark. However, in the last few years, we've actually seen a compression in 944 prices, with the high end of the market not actually moving that much. For my money, if you can get about £10,000 to £12,000, you're starting to get into an S2, and that would always be my preference. I would also say to buy a car based on the history folder rather than the mileage. Look at the car, look at the condition. Does it look like a good one? You should buy a car that seems to be well cared for, with enthusiast owners that have kept a nice big history folder, because then you know what has been done, and that'll save you, hopefully, redoing any work unnecessarily. Now, I wouldn't strictly say to avoid buying a low mileage 944, but do pay particular attention to early ones which had only a 5-digit odometer, so are much easier to clock. And in truth, the fact the car has miles on is absolutely no guarantee it will be a worse car. If anything, given the age of them now, buying a low mileage car may simply mean you're buying into an unknown restoration project, because time affects these just as much as mileage, if not more so. And that means you really should consider all of the cars on the market, look at them, and hopefully this video will have helped you make something of an informed choice. If you think there's something about the 944 that I should have included but haven't, please do pop into the comment section down below, leave a message, and we'll join in the conversation with you shortly. For now, thanks for watching. Please like, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.